We have Thea Riofrancos, who is an assistant professor of political science at Providence College and the author of Resource Radicals. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, N+1, Jacob and the Los Angeles Review of Books, Dissent, and In These Times. She serves on the steering committee of the DSA's Eco-Socialist Working Group. Alyssa Battistoni is a Postdoctoral Fellow at Harvard University and editor at Jacobin. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, N+1, The Nation, Jacobin, In These Times, Dissent, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. And moderating tonight, David Weinstein of Liberal Arts at RISD and the author of Book Chain of Critical Appraisal and Environments, Natures, and Social Theory. Without further ado, let's give them a warm welcome and get started.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm really delighted to be convening this discussion. Can you hear me here? Am I speaking in to the mic okay? Yeah. So I'm really delighted to be able to do this tonight with two of my favourite political theorists, political scientists. I can't really say how much I admire the work of both of these two people. I've learned so much from Thea about the state and about extractivism and about Latin America. I've read Alyssa's work avidly over the last 2 or 3 years, and I think she's written some of the most genuinely original articles coming out of the socialist feminist, a new socialist feminist wave that I've seen in a very long time. So I just think their work is fantastic, and I think the book is just a really great political intervention. So we were talking tonight about how we'll proceed, just in a little bit of emailing, and I said to them one of the difficulties that I will have is that I essentially agree with so much of the book that I'm going to find it a little hard to stick the boot in proverbially, metaphorically, but nevertheless, we thought we'd start out by our two authors giving a little overview of the project and what they're up to, and giving a little précis of the book to give people who haven't really engaged with the book yet a sense of what the debates are. And then I've got a few questions to start things off. I've got about 20 questions, but I'll only do a few, and then we'll draw you out, and if the discussion gets a bit quiet, I'll poke them again, and we'll see if we can get into a nice reciprocal engagement. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to the authors.
So can people hear me? It's working. I think I turned it on. Yeah, there we go. Got it. Thanks. So first of all, thank you all for coming out. It's really great to see a lot of people here, especially on a night when the weather is not the most amazing. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Darian, for being both for you have so many wonderful questions that we'll get into, and I'm really excited to be talking with you. But especially since we have so many. We've all learned a lot from each other, I would say, over the years, and have a lot of exciting things to talk about. So it's really great to have you here. I'm going to just say a couple of words. I'm going to try and keep the overview short so we can get into the discussion part, because I think that will be fun. I'm going to just say a couple of words about basically why we wrote this book and what we were trying to do with it. It's a short book. We wrote it pretty quickly. It's easy to read. But we wanted it to be sort of a political intervention in the present moment, because in the past year, really, I think, very much in almost exactly sort of the past year or so, I think there's been a pretty significant shift in climate politics, where we saw sort of in succession the IPCC report of last October, so a little more than a year ago, but the kind of 12 years to save the planet report. That's a simplification, but you probably remember that. Followed shortly by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's election to Congress and immediate announcement that she was going to make the Green New Deal a priority. The Sunrise sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office around the Green New Deal, which AOC joined. And what seemed like a real sort of building momentum around this idea of the Green New Deal that then sort of culminated with the Green New Deal resolution in February of this year, outlining a set of sort of climate proposals that I think we were all really excited by. And the four of us have thought about climate and environment and politics and resources and different kinds of aspects of I think, the climate problem for a long time. But I think we're sort of expecting, or at least I will say, I was expecting when I saw the sort of burst of like climate energy last fall that was going to just like dissipate very quickly, go back to kind of just being like a, oh no, we're all very worried for like a few weeks max, and then it would just go back to being kind of background noise. But it was very exciting to both see that there was some sustained momentum around climate and the idea of the Green New Deal, but also to see that the Green New Deal resolution was much better than I certainly expected it to be in terms of understanding climate change, not as sort of like a sort of separate issue that you could solve with like one easy trick or whatever, or with like a sort of minor policy intervention. That saw climate change as something that was connected to our economy and society more broadly, that had to be addressed through broader social and economic changes, and that's how climate change is part of how we work, what kinds of jobs we do, where we live, how we get around, what we eat, all of these different kinds of things that are actually essential to be thinking about what is climate change and how can we address it. So that was really exciting. It was also a very short document and not very fleshed out, and immediately got a ton of backlash, both from the right and from the, I guess, centrists, also on the right to our position, but but from, I guess, like the right, and then like the center left or whatever. So we wanted to say, to outline a case for what we thought the Green New Deal could and should be and why, and to make the case for why we think, as we say in the book, a radical Green New Deal is a pragmatic Green New Deal. And so we try to lay that out. And Thea can, I guess, say a little bit more about some of the details of what that is, and then we'll get into the details more of like what this argument is and what we were trying to do with some of the broader political argument in our conversation with Union. So.
Great, thank you. Is this working? Yeah?
Yep.
Right where Alyssa kind of left off, the only effective Green New Deal is a radical Green New Deal. And when we think about what the word radical means, we think about doing what the climate science demands of us, but also thinking about how we build a political coalition to actually transform society in line with what the climate science demands of us. So we were kind of keeping those two as our kind of North Stars, guiding us throughout this book. And I'm going to kind of, sorry, I feel like there's some feedback. Is there? No? Oh, sorry, I thought I was, okay, cool. Anyway, so I'm going to walk us through a little bit, just really briefly, each chapter, and kind of give you a sense of the overarching narrative that kind of holds this book together. So the way that we look at the Green New Deal, I'm thinking again about climate and about politics conjoined, is what is the political terrain that we actually need to engage with in order to enact the kinds of radical policies that are necessary to mitigate the climate crisis and also restore and repair the damage that's already occurred. And so when we look at this terrain, the first thing that we see are really powerful enemies. And those enemies are primarily fossil fuel companies, and there are also other corporations and the sort of ultra-wealthy that benefit from the status quo and that also produce the worst emissions. So one of our sort of main critiques of kind of liberal environmentalism or centrist environmentalism and of the climate conversation in general is that it's sort of like this idea that we're all equally guilty, and we disagree with that. We think that some people are more guilty than others, and we think those people are fossil fuel companies and executives in particular. And so the first chapter looks at kind of confronting head-on fossil fuel executives, both to build a political coalition that has a clear target, but also because there's no way to do what the climate science demands without keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And there's no ways to keep fossil fuels in the ground without defeating this political and economic enemy, because they will fight with everything they've got to extract the wealth that's underneath our feet. So that's kind of our first chapter, and we work through a kind of keep it in the ground kind of analysis in political, economic, and kind of climate terms. And then we have moved forward to like, if we're going to confront this extremely powerful enemy that's economically powerful, and that also has distorted our political system and is very politically powerful, what kind of constituency would we need to mobilize in order to target this enemy? And we talk about the fact that historically, throughout the history of capitalism, the only way to bring about transformative change is to organize those that are exploited and excluded and dispossessed, and to organize the working class, and also more broadly, kind of a broad vision of what the working class is today as a sort of multiracial, female-led working class. So thinking about how would we actually compose this coalition, So thinking about things like a jobs guarantee and other types of social policies that would actually empower working class people to feel kind of empowered to strike and to organize without fear of losing their jobs. So we talk about the policy end. We also talk about what jobs would look like under a Green New Deal and kind of an expansive view, and this is something that Alyssa has worked on a lot as Damien was referring to, of what green jobs are. So not just thinking about hard hat solar installation, but also thinking about the care economy and a kind of feminist socialist analysis of the type of work that is actually low carbon and caring for planet and for communities, and how that broader working class might be organized to fight for a Green New Deal and also facilitated by a Green New Deal. And then we sort of move into like, okay, we have our enemies, we have our like class coalition that's going to confront these enemies. What are we going to do? Like, how are we going to remake the world around us? And we get really into the kind of nitty-gritty of our built environment and thinking about how, you know, the homes that we live in, the transit that we use, the way that our energy systems are organized, are all part of the sort of runaway carbon emissions that have created the climate crisis, and all of those things need to be transformed, which is a lot of work, hence all of the jobs that will be created. But it's also something that is not just like environmentally necessary, but socially necessary, because our environments are also deeply segregated by race and class, and the Green New Deal is an opportunity to kind of really dismantle those segregations and build a world that is lower carbon, that is more equal, and that also has a lot more spaces for low carbon activities like just hanging out and having fun and going to parks and going to museums and things that don't involve shopping and driving and that sort of stuff. So that's our kind of built environment piece. And then the last piece of the book is thinking about the fact, what I see as kind of the one of the key dilemmas of the Green New Deal, which is that we can't actually build this beautiful new low carbon world without taking anything out of the earth. It turns out that building wind turbines and solar panels and beautiful new fully electrified housing and induction stoves and all these things that we do need and will create jobs and will make the world a better place also require minerals that are mined from the earth. And a lot of those minerals are outside of the US and in the global south. And so we think about the ways that a Green New Deal must be internationalist, must avoid replicating the patterns of extraction and exploitation that have marked fossil capitalism, and what, on the one hand, a kind of left vision of trade would look like in terms of the trade of those materials, but also what kind of grassroots solidarity across the supply chains that produce renewable energy and the infrastructure of our built environment might look like. So we kind of zoom out to the global and think about the sort of planetary stakes of a Green New Deal within the US. And I guess I'll end there, and that kind of walks us through most of it. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's a really great summary of the kind of the 4 moments of the book. I'm just thinking maybe we can talk, go back to the beginning again, and we can talk about some of the kind of the modulation, the difficulties of emotional modulation when we write about the climate. I think, you know, all of us write about the climate, and we exist within a kind of Twitterverse and an information sphere which is, you know, oscillates between complete panic, complete despair, and then moments of optimism where the only people who seem to be optimists are kind of neoliberal technocrats, to put it crudely, or very kind of technocentric magic bullet thinkers. I think one of the things that really strikes me as interesting about this book, though, is how it really tried to work through the dead ends of that emotional debate in some really kind of interesting and powerful ways. You know, you're not wowee, it's all going to be fine. You're not, you're certainly very critical of the politics of despair. And you're constantly trying to work a political response through this. And I'm just wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about, you know, how you struggle in maybe in that process to politicise the problem and politicise the solution in concrete ways that don't lurch either into kind of naive optimism or that despairing gloom. I mean, do you see that as important? Do you see that as a thread through the book? And what are your thoughts on that as your dialogue emerged possibly amongst the four of you?
Yeah, I think you identify well the things that we were frustrated with. So we didn't want to kind of go, I think we felt like there was on the one hand a sort of, someone will invent the technology that will sort of make fossil fuels so we can get off of really easily and then it will all be fine, or that there's some easy solution to the climate problem that, again, lies mostly in some kind of technological development that doesn't require other kinds of social and political changes, and this sort of always sort of futurizing one day this will happen or something. And on the other hand, I think that's actually kind of been vanishing in recent months. So that used to be a more dominant strain of, I think, climate discourse, and that is kind of being minimized now because I think people are not that optimistic. But then the other side being a very fatalist, kind of despairing, doom and gloom, it's too late, it's all over, things are so bad, how can we, it's just, that the future is going to be so unrelentingly bleak that what could we possibly do, and it's hopeless, it's pathetic, there's no point in even trying, which I think we have all seen a lot and feel very frustrated with, because for I think a lot of reasons. One, it's completely, it's, I think it's not any kind of, useful political emotion to have, and not that, or I think you can have moments of despair. We all have to kind of grapple with moments of feeling despair that we certainly do, and I certainly do at times, but to just stay in that place is almost fulfilling that prophecy, where if you just stay there and kind of let yourself be in the place of just kind of unrelenting doom, then that makes it more likely that will come to pass, because you're not able to, kind of imagine how you could act in a way to change that. And then I think we have to say there's not really an alternative to, there is no sort of, it can always get worse is sort of my motto around climate change, and I think that's really true. And so it actually matters what we do to make it not as bad as it could be. And even if things are, even if we have, we know that there will be, we will live in a warmer world. We know that the climate will change and is changing, and that will have serious, I think, effects in a lot of ways. That there are still things that we can do to make, to respond to that, to mitigate it, to adapt to it, and to make that not, this kind of truly dystopian world, and to lessen that, lessening degrees of warming really does matter. So we can't just sort of say it's all or nothing. It's, utopia or dystopia. It's probably gonna be somewhere in between. And we try to start off the book with a imagined future scenario that sort of, gets at that in a way, which is we imagine a sort of a Katrina-like hurricane that hits New Orleans that's fueled by warming weather, and that is the kind of natural disaster and extreme weather that we know we will see more of as the climate continues to change and continues to warm, and we're already seeing more extreme weather at 1 degree of warming, which we are at now, than scientists had predicted and expected. So we expect that this will continue to happen. But we also imagine how that doesn't have to, result in 2,000 people dying, and the areas of the city where Black and working class people live being totally destroyed, where actually there can be some kind of response that evacuates people, that rebuilds, that has a way to face and reckon with these ongoing disasters, and that also has a political response that emerges from that. And so how can we think about, this is real, this is happening, we can't just be oh, well, maybe we'll come up with a solution and climate change won't happen. We will be living with it for the rest of our lives. We have to face that, but then we have to think about, well, is there a way to not, that doesn't have to be a death sentence for us and the planet.
Yeah, I'm just going to add a little bit to that, because I think that was pretty comprehensive with the way. No, not at all, not at all. I mean, just exactly the ways that I've felt, and Alyssa and I have talked for what feels like years about our frustrations around these, two different options. Either you can be a really optimistic eco-modernist and think that geoengineering and sort of solar radiation, I don't even remember what it's called anymore, something radiation? Yeah, that, what was that thing even? Anyway, is going to solve the problem, that all we need to do do is deploy a technology and change nothing else, which of course ignores all the ways that like the existing arrangements of inequality in the world are first of all negative for many people and also produce all sorts of environmental harm beyond just like atmospheric warming, right? So that's not very satisfying. And also these technologies, surprise, like never quite work. I just watched Snowpiercer the other day and it was like, first of all, why had I not seen that before? But also, second of all, it's like, yes, things can go very wrong when you try to unilaterally change the temperature. So there's that, and then there's though this despair thing, which I maybe even find more frustrating. Even though some of the despair people are politically sometimes closer to me, like they're like cynical and worried and like sort of anti-capitalist, and like of course there's nothing we can do, just like throw up our arms and like if we try to do something, we're just going to replicate all the same problems and whatever. So that I find even more irresponsible because as Alyssa was saying, or just to like add a little bit to what she was saying, like every single fraction of a degree matters in terms of how many people stay alive. And it just seems like so irresponsible to say we can't perfectly succeed and totally reverse climate change, therefore there's nothing we can do. Like there's no in-between there. And it seems to be much more ethically and politically sound to say that like there are going to be a series of battles over the next 10 years, right, and beyond, right, of course, but our book is sort of situated in the next decade, and so we're not thinking too much beyond that, but like in the next decade, there are going to be a series of battles. The outcomes of each of those political confrontations over climate policy, over housing policy, over transit policy, are going to make real differences. Like, do we build out a bunch of mass transit so that many more of us don't use cars and emit less? Do we, build a world that requires rapacious resource extraction or not? Do we build a world in which we provide low carbon options for leisure and pleasure, or do we not? And like each of these are going to be complex battles where we're not going to get everything we want because that's not how politics work, but we might make the world a slightly better place or part of the world a better place. And since we know like climate is planetary and anything that happens anywhere in the world matters for like, this planetary condition, like all of our battles matter, right? Every degree matters, every political confrontation matters, and that isn't to say that like you should drop everything you're doing and like only devote yourself to the climate fight, though, it wouldn't be a terrible decision to make, but it does mean that like, that there are gradations of better and worse, and like the politically and ethically responsible thing to do is to like think about what are our options in this moment, what coalitions can we get together, what policies can we push for, and then we're in a new terrain. Like once we like win or partially win those battles, then we're in a new scenario and new vistas open up. But giving up is like basically, resigning a lot of people to death and harm, which I think is not an adult thing to do.
I mean, just to pick up on this despair narrative, I mean, a few things strike me about this narrative. One of them is that there's a deep kind of class politics to this narrative, in that, there's so many New York Times books now published, as Kate, one of your co-writers, Aronoff, mentions, by kind of white, middle-aged, midlife crisis elegies to the world that has gone. Always kind of written from the high perspective of some plush Manhattan kind of, apartment building where they will never be impacted.
Right.
So there's a kind of austerity porn, climate porn quality to this move. I think the other thing that strikes me about this move is that it is the extent to which climate despair seems often to be linked to less a kind of despair about what's going to happen in terms of the climate, but a despair about the possibility of social and political institutions changing. So that I don't know if you've had this experience, but you have friends and associates on Facebook who swing from, or other media platforms, better media platforms, who often swing from no interest at all in the subject to suddenly firmly asserting there is nothing to be done. And what they often seem to be saying is, I have no faith in movements, political change, institutions ever changing because the neoliberal bubble is natural forever. And so how could anything change? And this seems to be an inability to think about the idea that the social and institutions of politics are dynamic. And I'm just wondering whether, you say, let me push you a little bit, you say in the book at one point, all politics is climate now. And at one level I think that's true, But sometimes I wonder whether there's a danger in making that kind of argument, because within the popular press now, when we look at human migration, when we look at conflict, when we look at crop failure, etc., there's this kind of bullet point positioning that a lot of liberal media has now, where everything can be explained by climate. When if we actually dig into most of these issues, we know that they're multifactorial, we know that there are many dynamics going on that cause people to move, cause crops to fail, etc. Even wildfires. They're not susceptible to that kind of single story. So how do we kind of negotiate that tension? All politics might well be going forth climate-based, but climate is not determining everything, and it won't in the future either.
Yeah.
So what do we do with that thought?
Well, I'll just say something briefly to it. It's a good question. So there's this line in the book. I don't remember the beginning of it. Maybe in the 21st century, all politics or climate politics, something like that. I feel like it's a line I've repeated so many times. How does it go exactly? Anyways, great. So all politics and climate politics is to say. Is not actually to be climate determinist, though I appreciate the pushback. It's more to say that, like, we actually can't separate reality into, like, what is, the material stuff that impacts ecosystems and the atmosphere and all of that, and what is, like, institutions and political parties and movements. And so we're saying that actually, like, a radical political economy kind of framework, which is the one that we take, looks at the material world as a world that is, like, simultaneously natural and social, right? And so that there's no social entity that doesn't have an earthly quality, earthly matter, that's not made up of stuff, right? And so all institutions and politics have a kind of climate dimension, but we could even go stronger than that, because climate is not the only aspect of our sort of natural world, right? But that's more what we mean by that statement. But to get to your point about, is this climate determinism? I think it's not, because what I think we're very attentive to in the book is the way that is something that actually the Green New Deal is very attentive to itself. The Green New Deal as a concept before we intervened in it, which is this deep connection between climate and inequality, right? This deep connection between the climate crisis and the unequal organization of our social world, and that you actually can't understand the causes of the climate crisis, the consequences of the climate crisis, or the solutions to the climate crisis without understanding how deeply just emissions, if we just take emissions and not looking at other forms of environmental catastrophe, are structured by and structure social inequality. So at every turn, there's kind of this dialectic of, like, there's the climate impact and the way that emissions are produced and who bears the consequences of those emissions, and the kind of unequal and undemocratic structure of our country and of our globe. So I don't think it reads as climate determinist, but I very much, I'm glad you agree. But I agree with you about this sort of emergent kind of mainstream media discourse around climate. Now there's a lot more attention to climate, which is great, but climate can sort of take on a life of its own as if it's not the product of economic processes, of exploitation, of ways of relating to nature, of ways of relating to one another, as if it's sort of like a protagonist on its own, rather than something that's deeply socially embedded and is, simultaneously structuring social outcomes.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I do think I also worry about that, because you will see things that are like, as you suggest, there's like that, the refugee crisis in Europe is sort of the result of, like, drought in Syria that was, like, caused by climate change in this very reductionist way. And it's like, we should be careful at that, or there'll be studies that are like, well, warmer temperatures produce more violence, and in this kind of non-specific way that's just, like, correlated. Higher temperatures, more violence, more war, or something, and that's, I think, a very not helpful way to look at conflicts that are the result of social and political factors, as well as material conditions in the kind of literal, I guess, environmental sense. But the other thing about all politics is climate politics that we wanted to get at is, like, we can't keep treating climate as, like, a separate kind of issue where it's just like there's climate, climate change is, like, one issue among many, and we should, like, have a set of policies around it, specifically around climate politics, or around climate policy that might be, like, R&D for renewable energy or a carbon tax or whatever, and that those are like the climate solutions, and they are separate from other kinds of policy like housing policy or jobs policy or all of these other things, because and so we need to think about how climate policy is part of, or climate politics and policy are embedded within all of these other kinds of things. So to take housing, for example, we talk a lot about housing in the book and how housing, you need to think about how, where people are able to live. Are people living in sort of sprawling suburbs where they have to drive far out? Are they able to live in, the sort of cities, like the dense, walkable, transit, accessible cities, that like green urbanists will say, this is like the great thing for reducing carbon emissions is to be in a densely, populated place. But then if no one can afford to live in the city, as is the case in many cities today, we have like a housing crisis across the country, then, that doesn't really help very much if you have to go, you have to live further and further and further from the place that you work and travel into to be able to, pay your bills and a job in that city won't, like a minimum wage won't pay enough for you to live in that same city. That's a problem for climate, because that means that we have a more fossil fuel-based and car-based, infrastructure, and even if we kind of substituted electric vehicles for all of those cars, that's still a problem for things like the extraction of lithium from places around the world that, Thea was mentioning. Many of which are in the global south have been, sort of sites of extraction for a long time. So we actually need to be thinking about how actually housing and how housing works and whether people can access housing in a city actually is very much connected to climate change, connected to, whether people are paid enough to live someplace, whether, and then that has repercussions for things like how much lithium is getting mined in Chile. So like all of these things are connected. We need to trace those connections, and so I think that's what we're trying to get at, while also trying to be, without just saying climate is the only thing, climate is the only thing happening, or that even that climate change is the only thing that we should be acting on politically, because I think we would also say we should be all trying to build climate politics and climate, thinking about climate into whatever other political things we're doing. And housing has been very exciting on that front. So I don't know if people saw about 2 weeks ago, Bernie Sanders and AOC put out a Green New Deal for Housing bill, or introduced a Green New Deal for Housing bill. On Omar also introduced a Green New Deal for public housing bill. And so there's a lot of movement happening now that is emerging from movements of people who, out of housing movements, out of tenants movements, and people saying we need affordable and good housing, we need public housing to be higher quality and more livable and all of these things. That is directly connecting that to the Green New Deal and to the project of decarbonizing our lives. So that's, I think, what we hope to get at.
One just really quick thing, which is kind of one additional quick thing, which is just kind of to underline something Alyssa said, which is also the political context in which we wrote this book. If you all remember the kind of the centrist, mainstream, whatever kind of establishment response to the Green New Deal resolution when it came out last February was, this is just a laundry list of like a progressive wish list, right? Like it's like a jobs guarantee and Medicare for all and like access to housing and transit, and what does this have to do with climate? And like even some good smart people said this thing, which now just feels so ridiculous to say it out loud, but it has everything to do with climate, because the entire way that we arrange our like built environment and our social relations are the source of the emissions and the environmental degradation that we see around us. So there's no way to sort of just like isolate emissions out of this like larger set of structures and environments and somehow tackle those without changing anything else. And that's like the eco-modernist fantasy, which is that you can just flip a switch or swap in renewables and do nothing else. And and so we were really resisting both the eco-modernist kind of version of that and the kind of liberal establishment version of that, and saying actually no, a jobs guarantee is essential to a Green New Deal and is essential to reducing carbon in the air, and we can explain why, and we do that in chapter 2. And that's sort of how we kind of trace out the book with it. Yeah.
And just to kind of pick up that theme, I think what's so interesting and original about the intervention is how all the things that you say you do there, which you do, are such an interesting break from two traditions that I wonder if we could dig into a little bit more. I mean, one tradition is the long shadow of 1970s white environmentalists. which was so influential for such a long time, cast the conditions of debate in environmental discourse well after 1970s, key moments, Limits to Growth, Small is Beautiful, etc. And there's a discernible eco-productivist, I would use the term, element to your manoeuvrings, which doesn't sit well with that past project. I think that's kind of interesting, and it'd be interesting to draw you out a little bit on that. And then the second set of traditions which you are located in, but you don't really reference and you kind of move around, is really eco-socialist debates of the last 20 or 30 years. And so one of the things that really strikes me as interesting, and I think kind of valuable about the book, is that just kind of thinking about, for those kind of more nerdy types here who were interested in the evolution of eco-socialist theory, there were some very kind of critical moments amongst the monthly review crowd. John Burnley Foster, the metabolic rift, capitalism, nature, socialism. There are a whole set of debates that went on for decades about how to theorise the capital-nature relationship, and they're still going on. And dare it be suggested, I would say that they have a particularly embittered quality. Yeah. So it's distilled in failure in many respects. The debate became ever sharper and kind of biblical about whether the Talmud of Marx was read this way or that way, and it became a very troubling space. But at the same time, you locate yourself in that space. But I would say that, well, in the broad family, but in the book it stitches together a different genealogy. So there's William Morris, he's name-checked quite a few times. There's the socialist feminist moment, but then there is the decolonial moment, traditions of black Marxism, traditions of socialist feminism, and then a scintilla of Haraway, Andre Gortz, and a tiny spicing of a few utopian moments out of feminist utopianism. So you're doing a manoeuvre around. I mean, was that a conscious kind of manoeuvre? Did four of you ever sit down and actually say, we're really sick of this older stuff? We're gonna narrate our mothers, fathers, and genderqueer predecessors in different ways, or was it just a kind of a fruitful convergence of discussions over years?
I mean, I would say we probably didn't have a moment when we were like, okay, here are sort of theoretical underpinnings. It was, in many ways, I think, what the different kinds of things that we've all read and drawn from and thought about. We definitely did not want to get too much into, I think, a lot of the sort of like eco-socialist, eco-Marxist readings that you identified. Also, this is why it's so great to have Damien as our interlocutor. He knows everything in the world of sort of eco, like radical and socialist and feminist thoughts of all kinds. So, no, I mean, but like you have, it really is a treat to hear you sort of put together all of the different influences that went into the book in a way, which I think many of which are not explicitly referenced. We actually don't reference like Donna Haraway explicitly in the book, but Damien knows she's there. So I think we didn't want to get stuck into a kind of like, how do we, how should we read Marx? Is he can we get an ecology out of Marx, or how can we, what is the precise nature of like the ontology of nature and humans and society and so on, which I think a lot of those debates have devolved into, where people are like, okay, well, we think basically this is how nature and capitalism relate, but like, what is nature? And then they debate what is nature for a really long time, and we're like, we probably don't need to do that forever. At least in this book, so we wanted it to be a pragmatic book that was not something about, that was informed by our own, three of us are academics, so theoretical and academic readings, but not foregrounding those, and especially not falling into the debates that I think sometimes leave the political aspects aside, that leave the kind of like, well, what do we do with this? What does this mean for how we think about our politics, how we would address something like climate change? How do we not just say, kind of like get into maybe the increasingly bitter debates about like how exactly to analyze some aspect of the problem, but like how do we move forward? How do we sort of like draw on these different traditions? And I think all the traditions you named, actually I hadn't quite thought of it this way, but do sort of go to that all politics is climate politics slogan in a way, in that I think we see a lot of traditions that are not necessarily thought of as like environmentalist or ecology traditions, but like, thinking about the history of the labor movement and various sort of thinkers in the labor movement, or, in socialist feminism, or, what does Du Bois have to say to thinking about like freedom under, in the face of climate change. So how can these different traditions that we find politically inspirational be something that we can build on and see as speaking to climate change in some way, and they don't have to talk about nature or environment to do that, and how can we sort of bring that together with some of the things that we are thinking about in terms of like environment, or, and it's that we have genuinely gotten, I certainly, don't want to just dump on the economics, because I've learned a lot from them, even some of the bitter debates over the years, and I think that informs some of our thinking about ultimately, and we argue ultimately we don't think that capitalism is compatible with a habitable planet into the future, but we also should probably not wait until it ends to do something about that. So we should think about what can we do in the meantime. But I think that are very much, we do owe to many people who have thought about that relationship before us. So in some ways it's like, okay, so how can we build and try to move forward and look forward and think about what we do now?
Yeah, and just to say a bit more, I think that the traditions that you named, the reason that they're so inspiring, and this is kind of reiterating a little of what Alyssa said, is that like they manage, so I'm thinking about like the Black radical tradition, or the sort of anti-colonial thought coming out of Latin America, and socialist feminism, and then the kind of labor radicalism, and kind of even anti-work tradition that comes from kind of out of William Morris, is that they manage to combine in a really, I think, invigorating way, like a very trenchant critique of the social world as it exists, with a really inspiring and beautiful vision of what a better world might look like, with like some kind of like political strategic acumen. Like this is what's fucked up about the world. This is the world that we want, and this is the actual like balance of class, race, national forces that exist in the world that we need to like do battle with and engage with in order to like get out of this awful place into a better place. And like all of them come out of actual lived experiences of traditions of struggle and organizing. And it's not that, eco-Marxism is divorced from those. There was a radical environment, and there continues to be one, but just talking about the 70s onward, like a radical environmental movement. But we've seen, I think, more inspiration in terms of the social transformations brought about from some of these other traditions, and felt like we could, like as Alyssa said, like they may not have been about climate, they may have not thought of themselves about climate, but it turned out that like the lessons that they teach us about how to fight hard fights under really, really bad odds and really asymmetrical social terrains are very useful to the kind of fight that we need to have over the next 10 years.
It just seems to me, not to be too academic about these, but that the kind of discussions you're having are symptomatic of a broader shift that's really occurred in the environmental discussion, political environmental discussion the last, even like 2-3 years, which is that political economy, historical analysis, critical public policy now are really the ascendant discourses in kind of left discussions, whereas big theory, and I'm obviously using very generic categories, but the kind of the predominance of big theory, object-oriented ontology, endless debates about the Anthropocene, Manthropocene, Capitalocene, Heidegger and ecology, that kind of big wave, Jean-Luc Nancy's reading of Derrida's reading of blah, blah, blah. It's not that that's not important, that still lingers, but it seems to have been quite significantly displaced in how everyone's talking. And I'm just wondering whether, one thought I had is, obviously, you're quite right to say it's, the strategic and political questions were never addressed in that literature. But I wonder whether there's also something going on, which is that the media in which a lot of our quick political discussions occur is social media. And social media is more conducive to kind of empirical debates than it is theoretical debates. So if you think of a lot of the back and forth that goes on now, degrowthers versus eco-mod, cornucopians versus, a lot of them are resting on empirical points scored or lost. Whereas you don't see anyone who's the Marcuse or the Habermas of the Twitterverse. Literally who tries to, I'd be interested to know who tries to conduct any kind of social and political theoretical inquiry through Twitter. It's kind of impossible, isn't it? So there's been this kind of moving down. There are many forces doing this, but the media in which we use to discuss intellectual ideas seems to lend itself to a kind of a renewed empiricism, for better and for worse.
I think that's interesting. I'd never thought about that. I also still want to know what you mean by eco-productivism, which you didn't define. You said that earlier. But anyways, we can talk about that later if it's not for a flight company. Anyway.
Well, I suppose just to say that, I would say that the predominant current of green thought from the 1970s, say, till the 2000s, was essentially a critique of productivism.
Right.
And productivism was generalised to include the domination of nature writ large, all instrumental relations, but often kind of industrialism, full stop, green, grey, or otherwise. Yeah. So it was generally speaking. There was an ascendant kind of currents, and they were often influenced by deep ecology and those positions. Whereas your position is not a productivist in the Lee Phillips kind of, unleash the great forces of production and Comrade Stalin will transform the whole landscape of the Soviet Union unproblematically. That kind of orthodox Marxist vision of productivism. But it is a reclaiming of both the potential productive energies of the multiracial working class and the capacities of that to be allied to a new vision of ecological production, ecological making, ecological urbanism, transport. And that's different. That's a different move from other people.
Yeah, and it kind of aligns with, and we spelled this out a little bit in the introduction, but it aligns with our kind of complex or sophisticated, if I want to brag, view of technology, which is like technology's not going to save us, but it's also not the enemy, right? And what the enemy is like elite corporate control of the technologies that are life-saving and the technologies that can make our lives easier, but also not seeing in technology like salvation, but seeing in technology helpful technologies, right? Like helpful ways to remake our relationship with nature and with one another, and also seeing technology as something broader, perhaps, than maybe the way that the term is sometimes used. But I want to say something about the empirical, critical public policy, that other comment, which is I hadn't thought about it as related to the medium of discourse being Twitter, but I think another reason for that might be like climate scientists discovered how to communicate. I mean, I don't know. I'm actually in some ways newer to the climate world as such, and like I've done a lot of work mostly on like resource extraction. So others could, in this room could correct me if I'm wrong. But my sense is that in the past couple of years, like the language that climate scientists have begun to use in these reports, like makes it, first of all, the problem quite urgent, but also like speaks in terms that are socially accessible and point to like what the problems in our society are that generate these climate consequences. And I think that has like lent itself to just like a just enriched public debate on the left and elsewhere around like, what do we actually do? This problem feels both more dire, but also, I don't want to say more tractable, but like we see where the levers are. And I feel like debating on that sort of plane is more useful than big theory, even though I still read big theory and I learn from it, but it's not where I feel like political motivation coming from right now.
Yeah, I mean, on that, I think it's mostly a factor of feeling like the left is maybe closer to power than it has been in a while, that there's maybe more to be done with something like policy, or that there's something that there's a possibility of changing things that have felt very stuck for a long time. And going to sort of your earlier point about like, is any kind of social or political change possible right now? It's hard, and in the book too, I was like, this is going to be very hard. Like, I think it's not like we just be like, oh great, we have like a great idea. We want to like both generate some sense of like hope and possibility, because I think that is very lacking in climate discourses, like it's generally like, there's not a lot of like, well, what could we have, and could we have a world that we would actually want to live in? But also like it will be very, very hard. There will be a lot of setbacks, as Thea was saying. It's going to be kind of like, an uneven and sort of staggered move forward. But I do think that like that is not true only in climate, that as there has been a lot of, I think, political upheaval, feeling of political possibility on the left, but also feeling of real political, not only possibility, also of the reality of a lot of losing, and a lot of the sense of a lot of, the stakes feel very high, I think, is what I would say. And so it feels like, well, we need to be figuring out, not necessarily sort of like the, always some of the debates around maybe the kind of extremes of like the eco-modernists, of the like we can just build a nuclear plant for every home or something, versus like a total degrowth position where it's like, well, we should just eschew technology altogether or whatever. But that we, sorry for the unfair characterization of both of those positions. But also that we need to be paying attention to things like policy and to empirics, and to like figuring out some things that might work in a that are pragmatic in some way, and that might get us somewhere, and that might that might work in some way. And I actually feel like in general that's a good thing, and I hope it can be informed in a conversation with the theoretical aspects. And I certainly find that. I am a political theorist, so supposedly I am doing big theory, but I think it's useful to be thinking about the empirical problems, and it makes you sometimes come down to earth a little bit on the theory piece, which I think is often a good thing, and is a way to maybe be trying to think both the big picture kinds of things, of the underlying principles that are motivating you, but also about what we are going to do in a really kind of concrete way that I think is motivated by a sense of both possibility and dread, frankly. So, at least for me.
Okay, I'll just ask one last question. Sorry, I just can't stop that, and I'll throw it out. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between the book and the Jacobin project, and the politics of the Jacobin project. Now, to put it very crudely, when we think of the beginning of the Jacobin project, I would say that one imaginary that you could have about how Jacobin's politics emerged was that it was an attempt to move the American left beyond the NGO, anarcho, anti-globalization, Battle of Seattle moment that the 90s, early noughties left was in. And if Jacobin had a pinata, the pinata might have a big A circle sign around it in its early years. Bush. I mean that anarchism. So there was in the, if you read the first bunch of issues, it was pretty much an anti-anarchist call to reclaim a socialist tradition. And one of its core arguments, running through what made it so distinctive, was that we must reclaim the state. The state can't be given up. The state and the federal government in particular can be a force for transformation. The left has to take that seriously. Yeah. Now, one of the things that I found interesting about this book were the unorthodox positions emerging in relation to that argument. In that, the book is very much a kind of affirmation of the importance of, federal power, political power, mobilisation to grasp state power. But there are curiously unorthodox positions in it, which I'm not sure that Vasquez and Carroll would be so happy about, where community gardens are prefaced as perfectly fine, where decentralised forms of eco-communitarian activity in the city are acknowledged as quite interesting, where multi-layered new political economies with diverse forms of ownership are given a nod to. You can have municipal, state, community, worker-run. So this is kind of veering farther, perhaps in an interestingly new space. So I'm just wondering whether, just to finally kind of draw you out there to provoke you, are you unorthodox Jacobites now?
I can start because I probably have more responsibility there. So I mean, I would hardly want to speak for Buck or anyone else at Jacobin.
I'm being a little cheeky there, obviously.
Yeah, that's fine. I think, are we in unorthodox? I mean, you know, like, to be fair, Jacobin also just ran a whole, like, reflections on the battle in Seattle, including a piece by none other than Dan Dover, who's here tonight. So I think there's, like, also a reclamation of garbage in the past that, like, you know, early, I think as you're right, like, early Jacobin might have been like, oh, we need to, like, move away, and then I was like, oh, actually, that was great, too. You know, like, Turtles and Teamsters, let's do that again. I think that's a great, you know, like, a callback in ways. So, you know, it's an evolving and faceted project, and certainly, you know, runs a lot of different kinds of things. I will say that I think that we are trying to do some maybe unorthodox, I don't know if this is unorthodox or not, but at least with regards to thinking about the state, like, we definitely think we have to use the state to address climate change and many other problems, but certainly climate change is just, you know, there's the kinds of entities that can undertake the kinds of changes we need are the state and capital, and we think the state should do it rather than capital, even though we think the state often works for capital. You know, there's also a possibility of it working for people who supposedly, you know, elected, you know, its leaders and have some for whom the state is supposed to be, in some sense, working and operating and benefiting. So we think we should do what we can with that and use this, the lot of power that it has. At the same time, we do want to think about, I think politically, that you can't just say, okay, well now we're like in charge of the federal government, so you can just steamroll everyone, because I think that actually will not work in a lot of instances. There are going to be a lot of places where climate politics hits the ground, whether it's like building transmission lines, across you know, rural parts of the country. If you just say we're here and we're going to do this, you're going to have a lot of backlash. People are going to be like, you know, we don't want this. We've already seen backlashes to sort of, I think, insensitive and or climate politics that do not take into account what people on the ground are sort of dealing with, or what they want out of their lives and things like that. And so it's like, you know, there's like a NIMBY version of that, I guess, but there's also a version that's like, well, can we be conscious of and think about how to build in, you know, local participation into projects so that it's not just like this kind of steamrolling thing that will hit a lot of walls. And make people unhappy and kind of have enough backlash that it's not actually going to be able to achieve the things that we think a climate policy should achieve, including, you know, like, decarbonizing, but also decarbonizing in a way that makes people's lives better. But also that I think we need to think very multi-scalarly about climate, and so we try to think about everything from like the local to the global, but in maybe different ways than we usually think about them, and actually ways that the local and the global, you know, are always connected in ways, and so that we, instead of just thinking about there's global politics in the level of the UN, and then there's national politics in DC, and then there's local politics like your city council or in your, you know, your community garden or whatever, that actually we need to be thinking about how those like connect to each other, how they cut across each other, how, you know, local politics at the lithium mines in Chile might actually connect to something like, you know, labor struggles in a Tesla factory in California, that there are these different sites of like locals that connect across the global, and that those are also the places we can think about the multiple scales of climate politics, rather than just saying, you know, big, small, you know, small is beautiful, or big is beautiful, because it's like also, you know, as I think you've been pointing to, there are a lot of dichotomies that we feel stuck in that actually don't maybe get us as much purchase on the situation as we could use, and the kind of analysis that's helpful.
Yeah, I just had a little bit to that, which is that one thing that we do, which I don't know if it's unorthodox vis-a-vis Jacobin or not, but it might be unorthodox in some corners of the left, which is that we kind of break the state down a bit into its different functions and parts, and we think of the state as multifaceted and not as monolithic. So sometimes the state appears in our book as like a repressive actor, in a good sense, like not repression like the carceral state, but like repression like we need to do something with these terrible fossil fuel executives and companies, and like we might need to use the state to regulate fossil fuel extraction out of existence, because it's only, you know, through state action that we can actually like enforce such a thing. We might also want to prosecute fossil fuel executives for crimes against humanity. So, you know, there's a repressive function of the state that I think this is really tricky for the left, right? Because you know, I'm you know 100% against like mass incarceration and the carceral state and carceral solutions to social problems, but maybe there's a role for the repressive arm of the state when we're thinking of battling as powerful an enemy as fossil fuel companies. So that's one piece of the state. Then there's another piece of the state, which is like thinking about social welfare provision and thinking about like state investment and targeted investment, especially in communities that have been historically disinvested from, right? So that's another piece of the state that we think is important. And I can't think, another thing that's important with the state, and this is less unorthodox vis-a-vis Jacobin, but thinking about public ownership, right? But then when it gets more unorthodox is like public ownership is not just about like the central state owning stuff. It's about like the public owning things, right? And the public might be a local public, it might be a subnational public, it might be, if we can think really broadly, thinking about what global democracy vis-a-vis resource extraction might look like, it might be a more global public, right? So we think it's sort of these different scales. And then another piece I just connected to that I'd add in, one of the places that, and this might get a little wonky depending on the crowd in the room, but like one of the places that there's very like polarized debate in the sort of climate and left climate world is around the grid. Like, how should we organize our electric grid? Should they be local, distributed energy, where we're just solar panels on rooftops and like, you know, every community has its own generation of energy, and we're sort of autonomous, and you can get this sort of small is beautiful kind of vision here, and also the community autonomy and community ownership vision. And then there's the more kind of big state, kind of like there should just be a national grid because that's the best way to kind of calibrate resources and blah, blah, blah. And we kind of sort of split the difference in a way where we say, actually, these aren't mutually opposed grid designs. We can think about a grid that has a national scope to it, but within it has like nested local grids that when needed for resiliency can sort of detach from the national grid. And so we kind of, you know, these dichotomies are so unhelpful for thinking about the built environment and about politics that we try to, as Alyssa said, like think at multiple scales at once, think about multiple facets of the state. And then the like last piece I'll add is just that we see the Green New Deal as one of the most exciting things about it the most exciting thing about it for me is sort of like the political terrain that it opens up. But like within that, an exciting feature of it is like the experimentalism. And some of this gets into the kind of critical public policy, like how do we actually think dynamically about public policy and where the ideas come from and who enforces them and that sort of thing. And so thinking about like maybe a community on a local level tries something out and it turns out it works really well. Like this community garden is like one thing like worked awesome in this community, and like then maybe there's federal funding thrown behind that so that it can be replicated in every community in the country, right? So thinking about how local experimentation can be kind of scaled up, not because we're gonna have a national garden, but because like maybe the federal government has a pot of money that can fund similar community gardens everywhere. I mean, I'm just kind of making up an example, but that kind of cuts across these unhelpful, I think, debates about like localism versus like state kind of centralism.
I changed my mind. One garden only. One giant national garden.
Okay, shall we throw it out to folks? Have we got a mic that we can...
No, I'm going to take yours.
So let's hear your thoughts and... I've had enough.
So I'm gonna. In your book, did you address population control at all?
We did not address, you can correct me if I'm wrong, like, did we? No, I don't think so. No, we did not address it. Because I think I can speak for the four of us in that we don't think like population in just some sort of disarticulated from the social kind of way is the cause of the climate crisis, and I think that's consistent with the climate science. I mean, more people are more resources, but it's a sort of simplistic way to look at it because people actually don't. Oh, sorry.
I don't know what's going on.
No, it's okay. Because people don't consume equally, right? And so like one of the I was kind of alluding to this earlier, one of the ways in which inequality is so central to understanding the kind of origins of runaway climate change is that extreme inequality enables like very destructive behavior on the part of the wealthy, right? So I like to kind of call them conspicuous carbon consumers. Like they just consume, and there's nothing to stop them because they also have a hold on the political system and are able to like push for deregulation and protect their interests. So unequal societies, just kind of as an empirical fact, are more carbon intensive societies, right? So it's not like population in some straightforward way destroys the environment. I think it's unequal kind of unequal consumption habits that are particularly destructive. And guess that would be kind of all I'd say on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess just to add some empirics to that, the bottom 50% of the people in the world by income produce, I think, 10% of carbon emissions. So I really just don't think that's where the problem is.
Okay, so
Oh wait.
I got it. Yep.
Hi, is this working?
We can project.
Let's project. So I guess I want to ask about the role of like the political elites, because it feels like in your book and kind of on the environmental left more broadly right now, we're talking a lot about how do we remobilize the masses and just like the public, and get people politically engaged when there's been like a stagnation of political engagement, which I think is awesome and just completely essential. But at the same time, it's like there are people like the conservative, like the Niskanen Center, which is like conservative think tank, that's saying no, like both in terms of the scale of and urgency of the change we need, and just the structure of American politics, we need to target the elites. And you could say you need both. And arguably looking at the past, like in, I don't know, like socialism in Britain emerged from a movement of the masses, and like the Fabian Socialists, which was an elite targeted socialist movement. And I'm kind of wondering where you think this book and eco-socialism as developing right now through Jacobin, like how it deals with that, because it feels like a lot of the discourse is talking about labor, like revitalizing the labor unions and focusing on the most marginalized people, which is the most important thing. But then it's like, how do you merge that with like, educating the people who are going to actually, right now, are being trained to like be in government and that kind of thing. So it's kind of a vague question, but I'm wondering where you think your book fits into that project, what you think about that project generally.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I can't speak for, I guess, the entire environmental left, but I do think that, and we actually don't talk about it that much in this book. I think our position is mostly like, we need to challenge, I think, and I think you're sort of suggesting this in your question, that you don't move the political elites until you move people who frighten them in some way, and you don't move, like you can't move the elites without moving the masses, and so I think it's like, on climate, I mean, I do think that that's been the playbook for a really long time, like just move policy elites and political elites who listen to policy elites who will say, okay, well, some like famous economists said we should just do a carbon tax, so let's just do that. We can get bipartisan support for this thing that a bunch of economists say they support. Like that has just been the move for a very long time, and I think it's, clearly failed. There's actually a really interesting report that the sociologist Thea wrote about the breakdown of the 2011 cap and trade bill, the Waxman-Markey bill. That was like the last kind of big push for climate legislation in the U.S. And her analysis is basically like too much attempt at like horse trading amongst elites, trying to get enough kind of that if you offer enough to certain maybe like people who might move from, mostly just like trying to move a few Republicans over or whatever to support this bill, that you can win. And it really failed, and her analysis of that failure was that there was not enough of a kind of like outside strategy of like building power among social movements and people who would actually push for that to happen, and that needed to happen for the next sort of round of climate fight. And I think that has been also the analysis driving a lot of what I see as the kind of reinvigorated climate movement, which is much more about building popular power, about being disruptive, about creating, making climate a political issue. And I think, one of the big arguments in the book is like, we can't try to just do this through the back door. The changes we need to make are too significant to just say, like, even if you could get some number of political elites to agree on some set of policies, the kinds of transformations that climate science suggests are necessary are really not something I think you can sneak by people. And if you do that, then I think we're more likely, again, like a kind of more minimalist approach to climate policy that I think has been the elite strategy is going to end up in something like the Gilets Jaunes protests in France, where you have people saying, protesting against higher fuel prices because they're seeing all of the costs of climate action and none of the benefits. So we're like, we need to do something different. So That doesn't mean that we can just like wave the wand of like mass politics and the political elites go away. That is going to be another whole set of battles, and I hope that other people are writing books about that right now, or other things. And I know people are and working on and thinking about this in that way. So we don't get into it too much, but I really just don't think that we can that we will get anywhere with that strategy unless we have the broader mass movement. And then we will still have to do battle with, not just conservatives, but also people, within the Democratic Party who are very reluctant to go down the Green New Deal road, not least Nancy Pelosi, so.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that. I mean, I think that there's some ways in which a resurgent, insurgent left can mimic some of the strategies that the, kind of neoliberal right did over the past 3 decades. But I think for the most part, our positions and our politics and our coalitions are just too asymmetric and literally asymmetric in terms of where power is held, but also just like different from one another, that the strategies don't fully map on. On the sort of where we can mimic side, I think that it is nice to see, and again, just Damien already pointed out, but to allude to it again, like this sort of efflorescence of policy thinking on the left in the US, in the UK, in Europe, especially like thinking about policies like the Green New Deal and a sort of related ecosystem of policies, like how can we develop them, concretize them, and get them onto the desks of our potentially kind of allied officials in office. And I think that that's great, but all of those groups that do that know that that's not sufficient because we just don't have enough resources or influence, like financial resources or influence or time or any of those things to kind of win through like an ALEC style kind of, policy laboratory that we just kind of like give people our policy papers and they're going to implement them. We know that policy thinking is important, but we also, without kind of striking fear, without mass disruption, without like a kind of responsiveness to organized constituencies, the policies alone probably won't get us very far.